Welcome to another episode of the Know Better, Do Better series on the Worth Listening podcast. I have my faithful co-host, Chloe Moore, here with me today, and we have a special guest, Shalini Kodaspodi. I will tell you more about her later, but Chloe, do you want to start by just introducing the topic today?
Sure. Our topic today is estate planning. So I know a lot of you probably think of estate planning as just having a will, but there's so much more to it. There's certain documents that you need to have in place. You need to think about just, not only when you pass away, but what if something happens to you, like you get sick or you're not able to pay bills for yourself or make medical decisions for yourself. So Shalini's going to help us to kind of talk through, what documents are important and kind of some scenarios, like what happens in certain situations and some things to look out for.
So now, without further ado, all that information was information I'd learned from Shalini in the first place. I think we should introduce our guest. Shalini, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Why don't we just start with you telling us a little bit about yourself, your background, the work that you do. Bring the listeners up to speed on who is our guest today.
All right. Well, I am Shalini Kodaspodi. I am an estate planning attorney out of Houston, Texas. I have been an attorney for the past 15 years. I have done a lot of litigation, and then I transitioned into estate planning because I saw that there was a need for this type of planning. Because most importantly, I'm a mom, and with that brings an awareness that everything we do is really for those we love. And I started with wanting to make sure that I got my own affairs in order. And then I realized how important it was. And it was something that a lot of us here in the US do not do.
Great. So I know you mentioned, litigation, and there's so many different areas of just law. There's estate law, there's business law, family law. Can you kind of explain, kind of what you do in the estate planning realm and why it's important to have an attorney that focuses specifically on estate planning?
So what I do in my firm is I do things a little bit differently. So I don't practice law the traditional way of practicing law. I have a relationship-based firm. What does that mean? It means that I actually build relationships with my clients. So my clients become my clients for life. Because estate planning is not a do it once, forget about it. Oh, I've got it done, right? It's not something we just check off the box and that's it. Because your circumstances change, the laws change, as we know. And you want to make sure that your estate plan keeps up with those changes. So I focus on preparing not just documents. I tell my clients that the documents that we prepare is a byproduct of the service that I offer. But it's really counseling my clients to really determine what their goals and objectives are to come up with solutions that would work for them.
Okay. And then also, you said you're in Houston, Texas. So are you just licensed to practice law in Texas? And just how does that work for people that don't understand?
So I am licensed to practice law in Trinidad and Tobago and in Texas. I sometimes do work throughout the country because I co-counsel with a lot of attorneys throughout the US. So I do planning, as we say, for anyone. For things like trust. Trust is not something that's generally state specific. There may be nuances in every state, but it's something that would be applicable in all states.
So we have a true blue expert on that's getting ready to drop tons and tons of knowledge on us. I think one of the things we need to start with, though, is like what estate planning is, because what I hear from my friends or family members all the time, or when I get to talking about estate planning to various people, is that I don't need estate planning because I don't have millions and millions and trillions of dollars to plan an estate. And so there's this kind of, misnomer out there that estate planning is what rich people do. It's not what everyone does. So maybe could you just start by breaking down like what estate planning is and what, documents people should have in place? And
yeah, well, first of all, estate planning is not for just the wealthy. That is a myth. Everyone needs something, right? Whether if you're young and you probably don't have kids, you still need some kind of documents. You need a medical power of attorney. Because when we think of estate planning, first of all, estate planning is not just about death, right? It's about incapacitation. It's about disability, right? Those are, that's like what you're thinking about when you're planning. So you want to make sure that if something does happen to you and you are unable to make decisions for yourself, that you have appointed the right agents in place to make the decisions that you would have made for yourself so that your wishes would be honored.
I love it. And the thing that stood out about what you just said was that it is for everyone. So tons of times like I said, when people do know about estate planning is, oh, well, I'm single. I don't have anybody else to worry about. So no big deal. Even if you're single, you own some things, it might not be a lot, but you do own some things, and you want to make sure that those things pass to whoever you want in a way that you want. And then also there's that idea that you could become incapacitated. So do you want a significant other, a partner to be making decision if you don't feel well? Or do you want a parent to be, jumping into that position? There's not an automatic sort of, hey, this is the person. If you're over 18, you need to have some document in place that expresses what your wishes are.
Exactly. And sometimes you may not even want a family member. Your family members may not have the same values that you have, and you may want a friend, right? Who knows, what your values are, or what you would want for yourself. For instance, when it comes to nutrition, how would you like to be fed, right? That was a big thing. I had a friend who, the mother and a friend of mine got into a huge court battle over that, because the friend didn't have proper documentation in place.
Oh, I never thought about that. So there's situations where people are on feeding tubes and things like that. And there are various things that are going into those feeding tubes. So what if you're vegan? What if you're gluten-free?
Correct.
You're dairy-free, etc. There's so many interesting things that play into this. Let's spend a little bit of time talking about some of these documents and what kind of estate planning documents exist that everyone should have.
All right. Well, the first thing that we think about traditional way of planning is usually a will, right? That's just the basic thing. Everyone thinks, an estate plan is really a will. And it is. And it depends on what your assets are. And again, what you want to achieve, right? If you want to avoid probate, for instance, or if you want your loved ones to avoid probate, then a will is definitely not the way to go. Because I tell people where there's a will, there's a probate. Because a will guarantees that you do have to go to the judge, and the judge will have to basically sanctify this will that you've created. If you want to avoid that probate process, or you have property in multiple states that you want to cater for multiple states, then a trust may be something that you are interested in, right? And that way you can avoid that probate process entirely, making it a lot simpler for your loved ones to handle your assets and have immediate access to your assets upon your passing or in the event of your incapacity. And then we have other documents like, all of the healthcare documents. So when we think of healthcare documents, we think of medical power of attorney, and we also think of end of life decisions, what we used to call a living will, right? It's called an advanced healthcare directive. And that really is, if something were to happen to you, you were diagnosed with a terminal illness and you were given a period of time to live, or perhaps you were involved in a car accident and you were left in some kind of irreversible condition. What would be the decisions you could make for yourself, or you would make for yourself, if you could speak in that scenario, right? You can actually make those decisions ahead of time. Say, look, I do not want to be left in that position. Or look, I want them to try. Science is expanding every day, and I want them to continue to try to save my life. And those things are deeply personal to a lot of people. So it's not everyone's going to decide this or that, right? It's really about what do you want for yourself. And then what I also add in terms of healthcare documents, I also add a HIPAA release. And what that is that it's a document that authorizes certain people in your life to have access to your medical records. And I give this example of if you were involved in a car accident and you went to the hospital and you have a sister who lives in a different country or a different state. And she may call the hospital and say, hey, what's happening to my sister? And the doctors will tell her, if she's not listed on that HIPAA, I can't speak to you, right? Now, those people may not necessarily have the authority to make decisions for you, but you don't necessarily want to exclude them from at least getting information about your well-being. Right. So a HIPAA release is a great way of accomplishing that, to make all the members in your family feel included in your plan. And then we want to talk about the financial stuff, right? So Let's say you're a single person, you have rent to pay, right? You have your electricity bill to pay, right? You're in the hospital. How does that get done? And that's where that durable, in Texas, we call that a statutory durable power of attorney. Who deals with your finances while you are incapacitated, right? Who makes sure that your mortgage gets paid? So we want to make sure that you put those things in place, and you appoint a trusted agent. And I tell people it's not okay to appoint one person. And I never appoint one person in any of the plans that I do for my clients, because if that person is not available, I want to make sure that this plan will work. So we appoint, successor agents, so that there is always someone there to assume that responsibility, right? People travel, people have their own lives.
That's a great point. Yeah, that you always should have to have some kind of backups to your persons that you appoint. And the same thing when you're designating a beneficiary for like a retirement account or a life insurance policy. It's always good to have backups for those as well.
Yeah, what I think of as I listen to you is, the idea that the people that you may entrust with these responsibilities are people that you hang out with frequently. So, in the chance of incapacitation, a car accident, should we say, there's a likelihood to some extent that you'd be in the car with someone that you really care about, and that they may also be in the same situation. So it's like, oh, if I become incapacitated, my bestie so-and-so, but you and your bestie so-and-so are in the same situation, and now who's the other person? So to go a few steps down with levels of people that, like you said, you would trust to be able to take care of things should something happen, I think is important.
Especially for young parents, and we're talking about singles being in the car with someone, but what about young parents? Parents who have a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old at home, they go out one night on date night, right? Something happens. What about that situation? Then you have a court battle over who should care for their minors if they haven't left important documents designating who they want their children's guardians to be.
And I think
that's good. Okay. Yeah, I was gonna say that's a great point. Just thinking about couples too. There's so many different considerations with couples, and especially when couples have children. But I wanted you to talk briefly. I know you and Lauren are both in Texas, which is a community property state, and I'm in Georgia, which is a separate property state. So can you talk a little bit about just the difference between those with couples, and are there certain different considerations that someone should have, like a couple that lives in one state versus the other?
Yeah. So in the community property states, basically, any property that is acquired during marriage is considered to be community property. That is owned jointly by both partners, right? And if you were to get divorced, then there's a presumption that everything that was owned by either party is community property, right? Now, separate property in Texas, in a community property state, would be any assets that you would have owned prior to being married, right? Anything that I've acquired, if I bought a house and things like that. Now, it becomes a very gray area. If I bought a house, but then during my marriage, I was paying a mortgage from the income that I derived during my marriage, right? So then it becomes kind of complicated, right? So I think that estate planning really assists couples by really planning ahead of time, saying, look, if we were to get divorced, this would be my separate property, this would be your separate property, this would be community property, right? Having the yours, mine, ours discussion, which is sometimes so difficult to have, but is important. And that can make a potential divorce a lot simpler, because you come in with the expectation of this is what's mine, this is what's yours, this is what's ours. So it does help in that respect. In a separate property state, basically everything that's titled in your name is yours, even if you're married, right? So that's the difference between, a community property state and a separate property state.
Awesome. And I know there's some, I have a lot of clients, and I'm sure, Lauren, you have the same thing, that are in long-term relationships, and people are choosing not to get married these days. And especially, some of them may have kids together. So how would you advise on, just setting up an estate plan in situations like that, or just some things to think about?
So in a situation like that, it depends. Have they, I ask questions like, do they hold themselves out to be a married couple? Because in Texas, we do have a common law marriage, where you could be considered to be married. You can file your taxes together, right? It depends on if you hold out yourself to be a husband and wife. I say, oh, this is my husband, even though we don't have a marriage license. This is my husband. If I represent that person to be my husband, then for all intents and purposes, he is. So I really, and that's where the counseling of my clients really comes in, where I sit with them and I figure out what their relationship is like, what their dynamic is like. But as a general rule, I would say that even if you're not married, having a discussion as a married couple, saying, okay, well, let's figure out, well, what's going to be joint for the kids, what is going to be mine, what is considered yours, and we can do separate estate planning that would benefit joint children.
No, that's super helpful. One of the things I think of as we kind of talk about partners or domestic partners, or people choosing to live together for various reasons and not get married, is home buying. That's something that comes up all the time. Is we want to buy this home together. We're both putting money out of each of our separate pockets, but we would, if we were to break up or go our separate ways, we need a way to be able to get our separate funds. Is there ways to go about that from an estate planning process? Like, I put the whole down payment down, but you pay, we go 50-50 on the mortgage. Do the documents actually say, you get X percent and this person gets X percent, or how do people kind of sort through that?
That is the beauty of an estate plan. When you take a proactive step, is that you all of the options are open to you. You're not having knee-jerk responses when something happens, right? So you can do anything you want in an estate plan. You can say, look, if something were to happen to me, I don't have any other family members, but I want you to inherit this property. But if we were to break up, then this is how we want to split this up, right? And we can do agreements within your estate plan that can accomplish those goals for you.
Great. And then just thinking about too, people are getting married a little bit later in life. They're accumulating a lot of assets. And I know this kind of, I guess, teeters the line between estate planning and family law. But maybe you can help us understand a little bit better. Just when do you recommend a prenuptial agreement? And then, would an estate planner help with that, or a family law attorney? Just kind of what are the pros and cons and things to think about?
So it depends. It depends on how complex the estate is. I do some prenups for my clients, but if it's complex, then I have family law attorneys that I trust that would do a really good job for my clients, and I would bring them in and say, well, I need you to prepare this for me. There is nothing wrong with doing a prenup. Absolutely nothing wrong with doing a prenup. And there is no requirement that I should have this amount of assets to do a prenup, or there's a threshold for doing a prenup. Absolutely not. If there's any property that you want to protect from a possible future divorce, then yes, do a prenup. Definitely do a prenup. I tend to tell people, especially where there are kids involved, yes, people are getting married later, but people are also, there's so many more blended families, right? I'm in a blended family. And with that, we bring our own children, right? So it's, again, the mine, yours, ours, right? So I want certain of my assets to go to my kids, right? And a prenup in that situation would be very useful, saying, hey, this is not part of our estate at all. This goes to my children, upon my death. And again, every family is different. So every estate plan will look differently, but it's a matter of sitting down with your attorney and really, figuring out what your goals are as a couple, and not being offended by anything, right? It's really, don't take these things personally. These are assets for me that you want to leave for the people that would need them.
I think this is why it's so important to be having financial conversations while dating, so that you can kind of get a gist for, the other person's finances, how they feel about finances overall, and whether these things would be separate or together, or, the simple falling in love part of it is not in and of itself where the area of focus should be, because you don't want to get to couple weeks before the wedding, trying to get a prenup in place. And you're like, wait, what? I'm not going to get the so-and-so if you were to die. Like, and it's like, no, this is something that I've always had and I always plan to do and put here and there.
And as you said that, first of all, my recommendation is if you are thinking about getting married, you should want to have, your goal should be to get your prenup in place at least 30 days before you get married. Mm-hmm. So that's a little tip.
I would think that the process would start immediately, like upon the proposal. Like, okay, with wedding planning comes prenup planning. And I love too that you said that it's for everyone, because it is another one of those things that, you know, traditionally as it's been portrayed on television or as I've heard about it in, you know, my community, growing up in a community of color, that's something that is for rich people. Only rich people are trying to protect their assets. And I think that's a mindset thing that we have to get over as well, because, you know, we talk about wanting to level up wealth wise and do things that are going to take our finances to the next level. But it is to be thinking about, you know, how can I protect the assets that I do have, even if it's not gazillions of dollars on the front end. Otherwise, you know, you find yourself in a situation, you're like, ooh, they took everything from me and this divorce was terrible. And, you know, and all these things that don't get figured out when we have the ability to spend, you know, a couple $1,000 on the front end to make sure that you're not losing hundreds of thousands on the back end.
Yeah, and I think it's important too. Like the fact that you said, you know, this is something that's going to be a little bit different for everyone, especially with blended families. You know, that's super important. You know, just to know that if you could come into a relationship where there's a blended family and there's a small child, and so maybe, you know, one of the spouses adopts the child and treats them as their own versus, you know, if you have older children. And so there's just different ways to think about it, and everybody's, you know, there's not one solution for everyone.
Absolutely. And, you know, I tell people, you know, like people think that trusts are for rich people, right? That's, you know, that's what it is, right? And yeah, a lot of rich people, a lot of wealthy people use trusts as tax planning tools and estate planning tools, right? And I say that, you know, we have, you know, a lot of the minority population is becoming, one, so much more well educated, and they are acquiring so much more wealth, right? That we have to start with that mindset, as you said, Lauren, and changing the way that we think and start planning. You know, wealth doesn't just fall into your lap. That's not, you know, we actually have to plan for it.
It is so, so true. So on that note, you know, can we talk a little bit about the revocable trust versus a will? You know, when do you choose one versus the other? Are there any other kind of considerations as we're thinking through those kind of things that, you know, what should somebody say? What bucket am I in, and when is it appropriate for me to be looking into these things?
So a revocable living trust is a great way, and in fact, a much better way, in my opinion, of planning, right? I tell people that a will is great if you don't have that much assets or you don't have kids. And so maybe, you know, what happens upon your death really isn't that important to you. But definitely if you have assets that you don't want to be wasting money later on, or you want your family to have immediate access to your own money to pay for things like your funeral expenses, right? Or to make sure that your mortgage could still be paid, right? When we have a will and we go through that probate process, guess what? Everything gets frozen. All of your assets gets frozen. And then all of your family members are now coming together and say, oh my God, well, let's figure out how we're going to pay for the funeral expenses, you know, and start looking for money from each other to start paying for these things, right? And we all know how that can create conflict, right?
Oh boy. If I see one more GoFundMe because so-and-so kicked the bucket. Yeah, no, it's a real thing.
So a great way to avoid that is by creating a trust so that your trustee has immediate access to your own money, so that, you know, you would have your dignity, right? Your funeral would be already planned for you, right? And you don't have to be looking to family members to be paying your expenses, you know, even when you're gone. So for me, that's really important, right? I want to make sure that it's easy for your loved ones when you pass.
Great. And then I know another thing too, you know, with setting up a revocable trust, you know, when does it make sense to fund the trust during your lifetime versus, you know, waiting until your death? Because that's something that can kind of catch people off guard if they don't fund the trust and they set it up and don't actually put the assets in the trust?
So I say that if you don't fund your trust, like I remember when I just became a lawyer and I found out that attorneys were just preparing these estate plans, giving it to them, giving it to their clients and saying, okay, well, here's your documents, bye. And then you would have people who pass, and then when their loved ones realize that all they left was an expensive set of documents because it did nothing. It was worth less if you don't fund your trust. And I thought that was malpractice. But in fact, that is actually very common. Mm-hmm. So like for me, I have actually set up my process with my clients where I go through that funding with them. I go through that funding stage with them. So by the time we're at the end, when they're collecting their documents from me, most of their assets, if not all of their assets, are already funded in their trust, right? Because that is super important. You cannot wait until you're dead to fund your trust. That needs to be done immediately.
Yeah. And same thing too. I know it seems like very common practice for some attorneys not to follow up regarding, just things like the beneficiary designations and changing those and funding trusts, looking at how things are titled. If you have, for example, there's some assets that don't go through the probate process, if it's just a joint asset or something that doesn't pass by beneficiary. But can you kind of, is that something that you also help clients with, or?
So when I start with, before someone even becomes my client, I take them through a family wealth planning session. And before they come to that meeting, I ask that you come to that meeting prepared. I want your homework done. And on your homework, there is, listing your accounts, and I want to know how your accounts are titled, because that's the only way that I can really give you valuable advice, right? And so that's important because I want to know what you hope to accomplish, right? Do you want your kids at the age of 18 to get your $1 million insurance policy, right? By just designating your child as a beneficiary. By the way, my advice is never designate a minor as a beneficiary on any account. And so I go through all of that with my clients to ensure that their wishes are really what's honored, as part of their plan. Some clients say, look, I'm okay with my children receiving that money at the age of 18, right? It all depends on the child. It depends on the maturity, the financial maturity, right? I'm of the view that people really don't become financially mature until they're in their 30s, right? At least that's how I felt for me. And so I do believe that, designating beneficiaries are great. But if you want to create additional protection, there are so many additional tools within estate planning that we can create. I do something for a lot of my clients called lifetime asset protection trusts, right, for their kids. So within that trust, their kids can get what they need for health, education, maintenance, and support. But it's in a protected trust that will be protected from lawsuits and creditors and future divorce, things like that. So they're, as I said, the planning tools that are available are numerous, but you need to discuss this with your attorney to figure out what will suit your circumstances best.
There seems to be just like a million things to be thinking about. And it just keeps kind of coming back to me is like, you better plan for this now while you feel great and everything is in good shape, because when poop hits the fan, like to have to sort through this in addition to whatever the catastrophe was that, happened in the first place is no bueno. And what I see a lot, we've done quite a few shows on real estate. We've done quite a few shows on real estate in the Know Better, Do Better series, and then just on the Worth Listening podcast in general. Real estate investing is super duper popular right now. What do you recommend for people who are investing in real estate, have multiple properties? Because I feel like people are just kind of picking them up here, there, and everywhere, focused on the gaining passive income with their renters. But where are they maybe a little bit vulnerable, and what do you recommend?
Well, it depends on what your goals are again. Are you going to be an investor? Was that what your goal is? Or is it that I'm going to hold just one property as a rental property, right? That would depend on what kind of entity I would say should hold your property. And I say entity because a rental property should not be held in your own name. You're exposing yourself.
Hold on one second, girl. What did you say?
A rental property should not be held in your individual name.
We need some snaps, some claps, all the things. Okay,
yeah,
continue.
and I mean, I have clients that come to me all the time, and when I'm doing their plan for them, I realize, oh, you have two rental properties. Yes, and they're in your own name. And yes, if someone falls on that property and they sue you, guess what? All of your personal assets are now exposed, right? When we should be thinking about formation, LLC formation and things like that, right? And there are so many things available, series LLCs, all kinds of things that we can do to protect your individual assets from anything that may potentially go wrong with a rental property.
Awesome. And this is something else that I'm seeing a lot with clients. I've had some clients that are interested in taking jobs outside of the country, or just kind of living that digital nomad lifestyle, where they kind of move around. And I think COVID's kind of accelerated that too, with the remote work, and people are just kind of going to different locations because they can work anywhere. But how does that affect your estate plan? And what would you advise for someone who moves around a lot, or is considering moving out of the country?
So, it really just depends on where they hold their assets, right? Are they going to have bank accounts in that foreign country? Are they going to have bank accounts here in the US? Do they own real property here in the US? Right? So that is a very difficult question to answer without knowing more, right? Because laws in other countries are very different, right? Is there a tax treaty with the US in terms of how you're being taxed, things like that? Because estate planning also touches on your tax liability, right? So we want to make sure that you structure things so that, yes, you're paying Uncle Sam as least as possible within a legal framework. But so, there's lots of considerations there. So I'm sorry that I can't answer that any better than I have. But it's a difficult question. It really depends on where they're getting their income, where they're holding their assets, right? But definitely discussing this with your estate planning attorney on what would be the outcome you would want, right? Do you have family members in that foreign country that you would want to inherit those foreign assets? Do you have assets here in the US that you want, members here in the US to inherit? It just really does depend.
Yeah, what I'm hearing is that it's super duper important, though. You may have the pick up and go lifestyle. I am actually a kind of proponent of this lifestyle, that you shouldn't just pick up and go and still not have, like you said, proper documents in place. Because what if you jump off of a cliff, free falling somewhere in some fancy location, and you break your neck? Like, do you want to be buried where you are, or do you want them to ship your body back to America? Like, at the bare minimum, as we think about things. Or if you're ill, do you want to be, sent back to America to be taken care of, or somewhere that is more maybe appropriate than where you were if you were in, so for an example, a third world country when you got ill? There are some little things that you need to be thinking about.
And it also really, some people may say, look, I'm just going to travel for a couple of months and then I'm coming back home, right? But where do you consider home? Where's really your domicile? Are you just traveling, or are you living somewhere else? And that's an important consideration, because that would affect where you should have your documents drafted.
Mm-hmm.
That's great information. So another thing is, I know in your blog, you have a great blog and newsletter that you send out. But one of the things that I saw that stood out was that you mentioned some documents that parents should have if they have children that become legal age. And so, can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think it's something that's often missed.
Yeah. So when we have adult kids, your kids turn 18, they're off to college, right? I call it my grad pack, right? Where you have a graduate, you need to be getting medical power of attorney, HIPAA authorization, advanced healthcare directive, and a durable power of attorney, right? Because as it stands, if you don't have those documents, if something were to happen to your child, you actually have no right to go to the school and say, hey, I want my child's grades, or I want access to their educational, tools, or I want to have access to their bank accounts. I'm their mom, for crying out loud. No. You will get a big,
and you're paying tuition.
No. Yeah, exactly, right? And then you'll get nope. Your child is an adult. So I tell, when I do planning for my families that have college age kids, I say, well, first of all, that's part of your plan. We're going to have to do some documents for them as well.
Awesome. And another thing I think people forget about sometimes too is like digital assets. And so I know that's something that's really popular, but can you explain kind of what digital assets are and just how to plan for those within your estate documents?
So there are lots of ways that you can do it. So there's, obviously cryptocurrency and things like that are digital assets, right? And it's kind of difficult right now. I mean, it's now, becoming something. So what I tell my clients is that we need to know what those key identifications are so that your loved ones can get access to it because it's cryptocurrency, right? So that's one thing, right? But what about, things like
social media?
Pardon me?
I said like social media.
Right. So, Facebook luckily has this great thing where you can actually appoint someone to be able to get access to your account and shut it down once you pass. So that's really, really great to know. But I tell my clients that, as we need to have a sheet with your passwords and your login information, for things like social media, right? So that your loved ones can get access to those things. Anything that has to do with an asset, right? Obviously, that's not allowed, right? Everything is going to be frozen unless, of course, it's contained within your estate plan. It's your trustee acting in that capacity. But other than that, like, you need to make an account of all of these things. I tell my clients, you remember the days when someone passed and your loved ones will like sit by the mailbox for a few months and wait till all the mail comes in so that they can know what you have? We can't do that anymore. I don't know about you, but I don't have any mail coming at my house. Right. And just the other day, I found an account. I had a Wells Fargo, and it had like $500 in it. And I was like, "Oh my God, this was not included in my estate plan." And I said, "Look, my children would have not gotten that $500, and it's only $500, but it's my $500." So I want to make sure that my clients, all of their assets are considered in their plan. So we do an asset spreadsheet that is updated every year to make sure it includes all of their assets so nothing gets lost. There's currently, in the United States, there's currently approximately $58 billion worth of assets in the various departments of unclaimed property, right? Those assets get lost there because family members didn't know that their loved ones had this asset or that asset and no one ever claimed it. So to avoid my clients losing any of their assets in that way, we create an inventory of their assets that we frequently update.
Wow, 58 billion?
Correct.
Yeah, I think we should include the link in the show notes because there is a way to go and see if you have any unclaimed property. Even if you move from place to place, as an example, I moved 5 times in 5 years. You're cutting off lights at one place and cutting it on at the next, and they need to do prorated amounts and things like that. You can go there. I actually found like $132 fairly recently on the unclaimed property website.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good point. And just thinking about bank accounts, when someone passes away, everything's online, so you have no clue, where their accounts are or what's happening.
So and a lot of times when you do just like a will-based plan, or we do the traditional style of planning, I draft a will for you, send you on your way, we forget that part of it, right? But with me, I think that that's really, really important to make sure that your plan stays up to date with your assets, so that nothing gets lost.
All right.
So as we kind of think to, start wrapping this up, can you speak to some of the common mistakes that happens with estate planning or asset transfers, or, stories that you've heard, or even experiences that you've had that like, that was a terrible faux pas?
Yeah. So we spoke about a couple of them already throughout this podcast. So obviously the first thing is that estate planning is not for the wealthy, right? But estate planning is really a proactive plan. Okay. It's not just for wealthy people. You have things that matter to you, which is your health and your well-being. So even if you don't have a lot of assets, right, but you know that, hey, I want to be cared for in this particular way, then you should be doing at least the very bare minimum kind of estate planning. All right. The second thing is that, as I said, I was in law school and my friend's father-in-law passed away. And he had spent about $3,000, I think it was $3,500 on an estate plan. And they thought, okay, well, everything was set. When he passed, well, that wasn't the case, because we go back to the trust documents that were created for him. He actually never funded it, or the attorney never made sure that the trust was actually funded. So nothing was in the trust, and they ended up in this huge court battle with my friend's stepmom.
Oh no!
So that was a huge mess. Let me think. There's so many things that could go wrong. Not appointing a legal guardian for your kids, right? That's a big one, right? When you don't appoint legal guardians for your kids, what happens is that you go through a guardianship or conservatorship process with the court system. And guess who makes the decision of who should care for your kids? A judge, a complete stranger who knows nothing about your family, knows nothing about your children, knows nothing about you. And that's the person who's actually going to be making a decision of who should care for your kids, right? So those are generally the kind of big mistakes people make. And just here recently, I had a client who called me and said, "Hey, Shalini, I have no family members here. They live in another country, but I just need a simple will because I want to make sure that they don't have to deal with any kind of paperwork. They don't have to deal with court. They don't have to deal with any of that. So can you just do a simple will for me?" And I said, well, if we do a will, then you're guaranteeing that they have to deal with the court system, right? Because they do have to go through probate. And a lot of people don't know that, right? So my advice to everyone is to speak with your estate planning attorney. Like really, it should be no letter. I mean, my meetings with my clients is 2 hours long, right? Just to get a gist of what's going on with them. And that's the initial meeting, right? You should have a relationship with your estate planning attorney and really be open and honest with them about what your goals are, what your family dynamic is like, and what your assets are. That's the only way they can help you.
Yeah, one thing I was thinking of as you were talking was, as it pertains to common mistakes that you and I talked about previously that I hadn't thought about was, that same situation. You're on your way home from date night and something awful happens. You may have documents in place for once you pass away, the, granny that lives in Iowa gets the children, but you live in, California. So that particular night on your way home when poop hits the fan once again, who takes control of the children for that time? Maybe they're with the babysitter, but the next day or next couple of days until granny can get from Iowa, who's going to look after? So you need not just long-term care, but also some short-term people in place, because otherwise Absolutely. Your children end up in foster care.
So I do ID cards on my clients who have kids, and that they keep in their cars and their wallets if something should happen to them, so that the police know who to call. If it says, I have minor kids at home, and these are the people that you should call to look after my kids. And I tell my clients that usually it's about someone who can get to your kids within 20 minutes. It could be a neighbor, it could be a friend, it could be, it doesn't have to be someone long term, just someone who your kids know, love, and trust.
That's a great point. Well, awesome. Any thoughts or final thoughts or pieces of advice for the audience?
Stop procrastinating. That is the number one reason that we do not do what we're supposed to be doing and getting your plan in place. We all know that estate planning is something we should do, but we just procrastinate about actually making those decisions. Having some plan in place is better than no plan, but get it done.
Thank you. And I will add too, just a shameless plug. I think you should always think about using an estate planning attorney and not going the DIY route, because I'm sure you have stories for days with how that can go wrong.
Absolutely. Absolutely. A big part of what I do is do it yourself, or what we call the unlegal Zoom or Rocket Lawyer or one of those things, right? You're not actually speaking to someone, right? You're plugging in some information and you don't know what you don't know, right? So I strongly suggest that you speak to an attorney, because your plan may not work the way that you think that it's going to work. So that's where you need to actually speak with an attorney and get that advice. But I also believe that estate planning is more than just your wealth, right? It's more than just your financial wealth, and it's the legacy that you leave behind. It's about your experiences, your insights, your stories, who you are, because you are in this world and on this earth for a reason, and your story matters. So as part of my estate planning process is I do legacy interviews with my clients to ensure that their legacy, after all the money is done, their legacy lives on forever. And I tell my clients, sometimes it's great, when you leave money for your loved ones, and sometimes that really doesn't matter because all they want to do is hear your voice or see your face, and that's what I hope to accomplish with my legacy planning.
That's amazing. So I think that should be our money quote for today.
Right.
Your story matters. Like that's Shalini Codispoti.
And
Build wealth more than money.
Yeah. Well, how can listeners get in touch with you?
You can email me at clientservices@codispoti-law.com. I think you guys can put it in the show notes. I'm on Facebook. I do a Facebook Live every Wednesday called Coffee with Codispoti, where I answer any of your estate planning questions. So, feel free to hop on there and ask me anything as it relates to estate planning.
I love that you're so accessible. I think, it's that yet another thing that we think of when we think of estate planning is like a big stuffy lawyer behind a big fancy desk that, is kind of talking down to you. And, you gave us some very practical information and very normal layman's terms. And I love that you're on social media like, hey, I'm here, ask me anything. So that new school way of being able to get in touch with people and interact with people is a very important thing. And it really shows that, you're a person and you're relational and that, I can help you get this done, but I'm also very smart and I'm going to make sure this is done to a T.
Correct. Yep.
All right. Well, thanks so much for being on the show, Shalini.
Thank you for having me. You girls are awesome.